So let's start. My name is Robert Gordon. I'm the president of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. We've been around since 1909. Our original mandate, and a mandate that we still adhere to, is to provide support, assistance to homeowners and businesses in Chevy Chase. We were originally responsible for a lot of the development of schools, playgrounds in the very early days of Chevy Chase. We're very pleased to have Council Chairman Phil Mendelson with us. We are going to be concentrating on a number of topics, mainly around development in Chevy Chase, development in Rock Creek West, and we have quite a few questions that have come from residents in the area, and we're going to try to get through a very full agenda. So let me start. Residents of Chevy Chase generally applaud the mayor's goal of adding a significant amount of housing across Washington, D.C., and in particular, affordable and workforce housing. We recognize that the housing market is tight and expensive in this neighborhood. We welcome and encourage racial and economic diversity in Chevy Chase. What we want to learn tonight is how it will work and how will our neighborhood be affected. Chairman Mendelson, most of the questions this evening are from residents. Some are quite general, while others get deep into the weeds of land use, affordability, and provisions of the comp plan. We'll try to leave time for additional questions from attendees. Attendees, if you have questions, please write them in the Q&A section, not the chat function. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, given that we are asking Chairman Mendelson to be with us for about an hour or maybe a little bit more. So let me start with some of the questions that I've received. We received several similar questions from residents about racial, economic, and social equity. I will read one of them, and this is for Chairman Mendelson. Please speak to how the comp plan amendments specific to Rock Creek West and Chevy Chase in particular will enable us to address historical inequities, discrimination, and displacement, and help make this area become a more diverse and racially inclusive community. Sir?
I want to begin by saying that the comprehensive plan is a planning document. It is not policy in the sense of economic legislation. So when we talk about the legacy of racism, such as redlining, which was an economic constraint on where minorities, particularly African Americans, could get financing for housing, the solution to that is going to be an economic solution. The comprehensive plan is a plan. It is not economic legislation. But what the comprehensive plan does do is it changes the emphasis of planning and development for the next, I'm going to say next decade, to focus on the development of housing and affordable housing. 2006, when the current plan was originally written, its focus was on economic development, whatever that means. I think that means more commercial development downtown, as well as more apartment buildings around the city. But that's what its focus was. The focus with the amendments that we've made to the comprehensive plan is that we need more housing in the city and more affordable housing. And I always say it that way, because the demand for housing is so great that what we're seeing is that people who have means are moving into neighborhoods where the housing is very low cost. And that in turn reduces the amount of affordable housing that is available to those who are earning, let's say, 80% of the area median income or 60% of the area median income. So we need to increase supply of housing in general, and especially what we call affordable housing. What the comprehensive plan says is that when you look at the demographics of the city, those who are struggling with affordability are overwhelmingly African Americans. And when you look at what the earnings of African Americans are, on average, it's about $40,000 a year. Whereas on average for whites, it's substantially higher, substantially higher. So the comprehensive plan says that where there's public land involved, there must be an attention to extremely low income affordable housing. To bring it more into focus for west of the park, we have strategies such as, through the comprehensive plan, calling for increased density in some areas like Friendship Heights, and to some extent in Chevy Chase, and that increased density could be what's available in terms of affordable housing through programs such as what we call inclusionary zoning. So that in that way, we will see more affordable housing and more affordable housing development west of the park.
That's clear, and it may have answered the next question. The City Council acted yesterday on the comprehensive plan amendments. Many people here are puzzled by the comp plan's vocabulary and legislative process. Could you break it down for us and explain where things stand with the changes to the comp plan amendments?
Well, I did touch on that in my answer. So what we did with the comprehensive plan yesterday was to adopt on a preliminary basis a plan that changes the emphasis to housing, affordable housing, and requiring land use agencies such as the Zoning Commission to develop and utilize what we call a racial equity lens. There are many ways to explain what a racial equity lens is, but one of the ways is that race will not be a predeterminant of what the outcome is. That's one way of looking at what a racial equity lens is. Another way of looking at it is that recognizing that lower income and marginalized communities, predominantly African American, are less likely to participate, to look at ways to improve the ability of those communities to participate in the land use process. Another way to look at a racial equity lens is we would like to see a greater economic diversity with regard to where people are living in the city. Poor people should not all be concentrated in one neighborhood. And in fact, what we've seen, I've actually seen this for decades. I used to be a resident in McLean Gardens. We had some inclusionary zoning and development along Wisconsin Avenue. It wasn't large, but there were a number of low income or lower income people who were able to live in that community because with inclusionary zoning, we have lower prices for those units, those inclusionary zoning or IZ units. There is a value to trying to disperse lower income households. I don't mean by that to transform a neighborhood, but rather to have a greater mix of economic households. And we see that that doesn't create damage to the more affluent households. And if the mix is done well, and we see that for the lower income household, that it actually increases opportunities and makes a big difference in the long run with regard to those families being able to climb out of poverty. So I got a little bit sidetracked by getting into that. Let me speak about the process. The comprehensive plan was adopted in 2006 with a 20-year horizon. It called for amendments every, I believe, 5 years. The executive has done a pretty poor job of complying with that. So we got amendments in 2010 and we got amendments in 2020. The mayor submitted those amendments last April, right before we went into budget. So we were not able to deal with it until the fall. We had a hearing in the fall. The markup was 2 weeks ago. I took a slightly slower process than we usually follow with legislation. So I actually released a draft of what our markup would be a week before the markup. Then we voted in committee. The first reading, which is a vote by the council, was yesterday. The second reading will be in 2 weeks. So we've provided a slightly slower process in order to ensure that people can comment. We've gotten comments from wildly different perspectives. From one perspective that developers build housing and therefore developers should be completely unfettered, allow them to develop housing however they will do it, to a very opposite view, which is that developers cause displacement. When you have economic development, people are displaced one way or another, and therefore you need to be more controlling over development. We tried to find a balance, and I don't mean by that, oh, we just said we'll do 50% of this and 50% of that. We tried to find a balance that will allow and even encourage development and encourage flexibility in development, while at the same time recognizing that there is a role for the community with regard to how their community evolves, and that we want to ensure that development doesn't overwhelm infrastructure, which would include, for example, transportation capacity. So we voted yesterday. The next vote will be in 2 weeks.
And is there an opportunity for between now and 2 weeks for changes to the amendments?
Well, there are two ways to answer that. The way I want to answer that is I really don't want any more amendments. But the truth is that there is an opportunity for more comment, and I'm sure there'll be more amendments when we consider it at second reading.
A lot of the comprehensive plan amendments are driven by the mayor's goal of 36,000 residential units by 2025. And of that, the goal is 12,000 affordable units. These goals are driving many of the amendments to the comp plan. I've done a thorough research, but I've not been able to find where the growth calculations are derived. 36,000 housing units would equate to a population expansion of between 72,000 and 100,000 additional residents by 2025. Say two to 2.5 people per housing unit on average. According to the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, the district's population grew by 4,202 in 2019. Do you agree with the mayor that DC will experience the level of population growth, and now we will need this many new housing units in DC? Has the council looked at the methodology behind the projections?
Well, the problem with the premise of your question, it assumes that there's adequate housing now. And every report I've seen says that there's not enough housing right now, that we have a substantial population that is, I believe it's called income burden or housing burden. I'm going to get the terms screwed up, but I think, you know, most people know that the standard is that a household should not be spending more than about 30% of their income on housing costs. And what we see is that there are tens of thousands of households that are spending more than 30%. I believe if it's under 50%, under 50% of your income is spent on housing, that's, I'm going to say housing burden. I think I've got the term wrong. And if you spend more than 50%, then the problem is much more severe. And we see that for, I'm going to say tens of thousands of households, it's more severe. So it's not about meeting population growth, although that is part of it. It's about dealing with the population that we have, much of which is on the brink of homelessness, some of whom are homeless. And what can we do to reduce that crisis in affordability, in which so many people simply cannot afford the housing in which they live?
But it strikes me that the new housing that will be constructed will be, if it's market rate, it'll be substantially higher than what people are paying now. If it's subsidized by the government, then that's perhaps doable. So people will move from the houses that they can afford to houses that are now being constructed, but will need substantial subsidies.
We want people to be able to move from housing that they cannot afford to housing that they can afford. If it's market rate, the government doesn't subsidize it. If it's below market, then the government probably does subsidize it. Subsidizes it through vouchers, or subsidizes it by providing a zoning density. So a developer can build 100 units, but through inclusionary zoning, IZ can build, let's say, 130 units. And those 30 units would be affordable. There are different ways to provide that subsidy. The really deep subsidy, the government actually pays for vouchers, as well as deeply reduces if it's, for instance, government land that's being sold to a developer, where we may sell the property at a fraction of its value with a covenant that the housing built to be built will be affordable, and affordable at lower, extremely low income rents. So those are different strategies to provide the housing. If we don't do this, then what we see is that with the demand for housing in the city, increasingly affluent folks will move to neighborhoods where the housing is cheaper, but in turn will be driving out the residents of those neighborhoods because those neighborhoods, those residents can't afford the prices. I like to talk about Deanwood as an example, where if you took a house in Chevy Chase, a modest house in Chevy Chase, and put it in Deanwood, the value of that house is probably about $300,000. And so there are a lot of folks, particularly younger households, who see that as an opportunity to buy a house and to begin with, earning equity or developing equity, accruing equity. But in turn, if I move into a house, if I buy a house in Deanwood, then it becomes less affordable, and folks who are in Deanwood are being displaced. And in the end, that's really not good for preserving affordable housing in the city. So we need to see more housing development as well as affordable housing. And it's not just about population growth. It's about being able to accommodate the population that we have.
That's very understandable. Thank you. So could you please explain what the various changes to the comp plan and the amended future land use map mean for Rock Creek West and Chevy Chase, DC? Once the comp plan and flume are enacted by the council, can OP or the zoning commission increase density?
Well, the short answer is yes and no. So what do the changes mean? In some areas of Ward 3, the future land use map, which is called the FLUM, I don't like that term. We've struggled for a couple of years to find an alternative. We haven't found it yet. In some places like Chevy Chase, the FLUM does call for some additional density on the major corridors like Connecticut Avenue. I realize that Friendship Heights is not Chevy Chase, but that's another area where there's the future land use map calls for additional density. But we also, at the request of the Office of Planning, drew a circle or lasso around these areas and said that there can't be additional zoning, there can't be rezoning without some planning being done. So there is an area plan being done, a small area plan being done for Chevy Chase. And I believe that next year the Office of Planning will undertake a small area plan for Wisconsin Avenue. And I think that's important. We did provide some exceptions. So if a developer comes into the planned unit development, which requires a much more extensive process before the zoning commission, what we call a discretionary process, then they don't have to wait for the small area plan. As a practical matter, because the Chevy Chase small area plan is underway, I don't think there are going to be any PUDs that come in ahead of the small area plan. The changes to the comprehensive plan not only include those increased densities, but also require that the zoning commission has to look at development through an equity lens. They have to develop what that equity lens is. I would think that for Chevy Chase, what that would mean is, to what extent is this development excluding African-Americans, or to what extent is it including or attracting African-Americans? I'm sort of oversimplifying it a bit, but I think that's an accurate way of characterizing what an equity analysis would be for Ward 3. And it really isn't just on race. It involves economics as well. Overall, the changes to the comprehensive plan change the priority from economic development, simply economic development, to housing and an racial equity lens.
According to the proposed FLUM, you call it FLUM?
I call it a FLUM.
I've called it being flummoxed. The density on the west side of Connecticut Avenue would go from low density commercial with a 40-foot height limit to moderate density mixed use with a height of 40 to 50 feet. So we're gaining 10 feet. What is the sense in disrupting a successful commercial area for such a small gain? I can understand MU4 zoning on the east side of Connecticut Avenue, where we have large open spaces such as the Exxon station, the Safeway, the library, community center site, and other parcels that are more suitable for development. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the plan is supposed to be viewed as a generalized planning statement. So it doesn't automatically mean that there'll be a upzoning. But think of moderate density as being like row houses or 2- and 3-story apartment buildings. So much of Connecticut Avenue, as you know, is dominated by what I would call high density residential, which is 9-, 10-story apartment buildings. We have those commercial nodes like Chevy Chase, which is a lower density. You know, if you think of U Street between 17th and going east, 9th Street, that's predominantly 3- and 4-story structures.
3- and 4-story structures.
Yes.
Yes.
Now there's some taller ones, but not very many. I did a windshield survey of it a couple of weeks ago. There's some taller, but moderate tends to be around 4 or 5 stories, as you said. So then economics come into play. If I own the Exxon station, maybe that's not a good example. If I own the, I can't remember what the name of the arcade is at Chevy Chase. Maybe,
You mean on the west side? That would be the Chevy
Yes.
Chase Arcade.
if I own that, and I think that's about 2-3 stories, is it,
It's got a tall atrium, and it's got shops on the bottom and offices on the top.
yeah,
And I think that's about 40 feet.
okay,
That's about at the max.
maybe about 40 feet. So is it economically worth it to me to tear that down to get an additional story? Probably not. Maybe the Exxon station, because what is that? That's mostly open space.
That's open space. There's a building at I think it's the corner of Legation and Connecticut that has 4 or 5 markets that has parking behind it that would be in the same category.
So I think what you'll see is that with the, what we call upflumming, there may be some redevelopment, but I don't think you'll see that the entire area is just suddenly demolished tomorrow and rebuilt. I don't think that'll happen at all. I think you'll see it happening incrementally, and it will require a developer to see that there's actually an economic benefit to acquiring the land at market value, and then taking the cost of demolition, carrying cost while it's vacant, cost of construction. And for the increased density, in some places it might be worth it. What I want to emphasize is that I think that that change will not be as quick as some people fear.
There's a wide difference between the west side of Connecticut Avenue and the east side. The east side has more, a lot less density. It's there's parking lots. There's a big bank there that uses a great deal of space. The east side is pretty much, shoulder to shoulder with shops, and it serves the community pretty well. So and furthermore, most of the buildings don't even reach the limit that they could, the 40-foot limit. They're mostly in the 20 to 25-foot size. So I'm just wondering if developers will find that as an opportunity to buy, raise it up, and does that actually, it will help density without question if they put apartments above that, but will it provide for greater equity, for more economic equitable families moving in?
Well, if there is redevelopment, I would say yes. But I'll go back to what I said before, and that is that I think you'll see that it's more incremental. It's not going to be that we vote tomorrow and in July or even next July, all these developers are going to come in and file for building permits to demolish. And we are encouraging that there be more what we call discretionary development. So that would be, for instance, a planned unit development, which then involves a lot of community input. There's a balance there, because community input, I think, is a good thing from the standpoint of the community. However, from the standpoint of a developer, there's a lot of risk. And I mean, I think what it really comes down to is a developer has to be reasonably confident that their planned unit development, or PUD, will be approved if they're going to go that route. But the PUD would be the way to maximize the density, and the PUD also would require more affordable housing. So I think that we will see over time some change, but I don't think it's going to be dramatic. I think that the commercial node that is Chevy Chase will remain a relatively low density area with neighborhoods serving shops. That's what I see. I think that there may be a little bit more efficient use of land. So I don't know that there are any plans where the bank is, but they have a large parking lot behind them, as I recall.
Yes.
And that's not very efficient in terms of utilizing the land. So it may be the developer comes along in the next few years and proposes to put in a 4 or 5 story building that would have apartments on the upper floors and maintain the bank and some other retail on the first floor. The additional retail would probably be a complement to what's in the community now. The residential at 3, 4 stories really wouldn't be, I don't think would be a burden to the community. Now, I'm not saying I think that's a wonderful thing. I'm just saying that's what I think could possibly happen. And that would be more housing. That would be more housing, increasing the housing stock for the city.
Well, while we're on that, there's the ANC has proposed and has done a lot of work on the library and the Chevy Chase Community Center in terms of creating a sort of a comprehensive, better use of that parcel, which is large, and I don't think as well used as possible. And part of their proposal is to rebuild the community center, rebuild the library, and then add housing above that, which to me is an excellent idea. And I think that most of the people I've talked with in the community also think that that would be one way to add substantial housing as well as substantial affordable and workforce housing. But it's public land. It'll take a large investment, larger, I think, than the money that's already been allocated for renovating both of those properties. What do you think about that idea, as well as working with the mayor to get the money necessary to do a really superb job there?
Well, in order for it to happen, a developer is going to have to come along. But we've tried this in other places and sometimes very successfully. Engine number 1. It's a firehouse on M Street. It's in the West End. It used to be just a firehouse. It got redeveloped. The fire department actually had to relocate for a year or so. And now there's a large apartment building above it. Some people may know it because there's a squash club. It's on the 2nd floor. The fire station was rebuilt. It's on the 1st floor. So it's quite possible that this kind of mixed development in which the government facilities remain, they're actually rebuilt and remain, can be successful and can be a good thing. So, I mean, I'm not here to pitch this, but if I were, what I would say is, all right, we're going to get a new library, a new rec center. It'll be a more efficient use of the land. We'll take the large parcel, we'll make sure there's a little bit of open space. We'll put some housing above it. Some of that housing will be affordable. So what the community will get is a new library, a new rec center. I don't want to say a new park, but just, you know, still some open space and some apartment buildings on top of that. And that's been done elsewhere, and it's been done, I think, successfully. Does that answer your question?
Well, the one part is that you'd go to bat for that. It sounds to me like that's the case.
Well, let me see. Would I go to bat for that? I think that if that development, if such a development were worked out with the community, I think it could be quite successful. You know, I used to be a Ward 3 activist. I'm now, and for 20 years, I've been a citywide representative. So I concern myself about the whole city. And I generally don't get involved in individual projects. So I don't know that I would say I would go to bat for that. But I think that would be a reasonable use. Is it economically feasible? Well, we'll see whether developer is interested. And the government, of course, would have to be a partner in that. So we've seen it work in some places.
Well, we'll see. Personally, that's something that I would champion and try to convince CCCA members and the community because it's a property that I use all the time. There are basketball courts, and they may change, but it's a good target, and it would provide the numbers that I think developing the west side would not provide.
Mm-hmm.
So let me get back to something else. In March 2021, just very recently, in a Zoom video called "Meet Up with Mendo," that's you.
Yeah, I'm not responsible for anything I say, but okay.
All right, well, we'll take it with a grain of salt. And there was only a small piece of it that I want to reference. You said you referenced certain language changes that made the comp plan amendments a little vague. You said a few examples of the changes you mentioned, wording, protect became respect, shall became should, protect became respect. Do you recall that? So it strikes me that the new words are kind of squishy.
Well, we reversed that.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Well, you answered my question.
Okay.
I don't have to even go further.
I believe in March, before we released, as I said before, we released the draft committee print a week before the markup, which means we released it around April 12th. In March, I would have been more careful on what I was saying, and I probably didn't say anything with regard to what I was going to do with those terms. The Office of Planning went through the document, and I believe their perspective was that the way to facilitate more housing development was to make the plan more general and to give the Zoning Commission ultimate flexibility, and through that, developers far more latitude. I think they went too far in that direction. I think it's I don't know what it means to say respect the neighborhood. I mean, I respect Chevy Chase, okay, so take that home with you. What does it mean?
Right.
But if I say I want to protect Chevy Chase, that means that there's a character about Chevy Chase, which is generally single-family houses on lots with a fair amount of land. I don't know if they're 50 or 100-foot wide lots. There's a character there. Some folks have thought that the character is such that it ought to be designated as historic. I'm not going to get into that, but it speaks to there being a character. And I think that ought to be protected. It's going to evolve over time. So protect doesn't mean that, in my view, that we stand at the intersections and keep the bulldozers out. But it means something which respect does not mean. So the Office of Planning had gone through the document, and I think they almost did it like with a word processor, where they just simply find and replace. If it said protect, we'll change that to respect. And so we went through and we reversed most of that. We tried to be mindful of shoulds versus shalls. Sometimes a should is a better term. But I feel strongly that a plan should be a plan. It should be a blueprint. You don't have to follow the blueprint exactly, precisely. It's not like an electrical diagram, but it should be a guide. It should be a meaningful guide, not something where you go to the Zoning Commission and say, well, I know the arrow points north, but it could be northeast. And I come in and I say, I know the arrow points north, but it could be northwest. If it says north, it ought to be north, and, you know, a little bit of latitude in there. So we reversed a lot of those changes because we think that the clarity is more valuable.
Well, great. That 100% answers that question. Getting back to the development of this area, there's been a lot of buzz about the district buying and renovating the Wardman Hotel building and several parcels in Friendship Heights for affordable housing. That would be significant opportunities for massive changes or large growth in housing and potentially affordable housing, whereas um, uh, what's going on in Chevy Chase would be much less. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you're right. The Wardman Park site, I don't know what to say. I'm almost kind of stunned that the hotel is closed and they're looking to just redevelop that property entirely. I don't know what else to say. The plan, as I recall, calls for high density residential. So there's opportunity there. Friendship Heights is more complicated. There's a long history of community concern. But it is true that Friendship Heights is bounded by arterials. So it's more appropriate for a more dense development. And with the closing of Lord and Taylor's and the long-standing desire to redevelop the bus barn, it's on Wisconsin Avenue, it probably is not best located on Wisconsin Avenue, that there is opportunity for more dense development. And so if we're going to see more housing and affordable housing in Ward 3, these are areas where there's the greatest possibility. I mean, there really aren't other areas that come readily to mind. I mean, I can name a couple other sites, but in terms of size, I would say Friendship Heights is probably the best opportunity for more housing development.
Yeah, every morning I wake up and I look out the window and I see 5333 Connecticut Avenue. And that was really the last untouched major piece of land that was available for development. And it's a 9 or 10-story building but in the end, it only had 19 units. It's got 275 units, I think, or 250 units of housing, but only 19 units of affordable housing. I hope that we can do better in terms of affordable housing in the future when large construction projects take place.
I would agree. You'll remember that development was very controversial in the community. I believe it was as of right.
Yes.
We have changed the inclusionary zoning requirements, so I think at this point more affordable units would be required. But we also have changed our thinking to the comprehensive plan, but I think also just agencies like the Office of Planning are interested in seeing more affordability. So we probably, if that project were to start tomorrow instead of whatever it was, 7 years ago.
About 10, more like 10 years ago.
Okay. If that project were to start tomorrow, I think we would see more affordable unit. And, you know, I will repeat what I said before. I think the mix of affordability is a good thing. I used to live at McLean Gardens. There were some affordable units that were built in the new construction along Wisconsin Avenue. Nobody noticed. It was a good thing to mix the incomes and provide more opportunity in these neighborhoods. So I do want to note one other thing, which is not what you asked. And that is one of the tensions that I'm dealing with at the council is that there are a couple of council members who believe that low density residential is inefficient and it needs to be replaced with more dense housing. And I just think that's a mistake. And I'm bringing that up here. I will agree that low density, single family housing is not an efficient use of land, but there are people who want to live in single family houses with a yard. They just do. And I think we have to recognize that. And we're not like other cities where a substantial, in fact, an overwhelming proportion of their residential land is zoned for single family detached houses. We're not like that. Let me say a little bit more, because you didn't ask about that, and I don't know that people have thought about this, but a couple of years ago, Councilmember Nadeau from Ward 1 actually proposed to get rid of single family zoning. And I was able to persuade her that instead the Office of Planning should do a study, and they did a study which was published last year, which you could get by going to the Office of Planning's website. But that was based on in reaction to what happened in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has done a few things to get on the map, but one of the things they did was they voted to get rid of single family zoning. 70, as I recall, close to 80% of the residential land was zoned for single family density.
Yes.
Single family, detached housing.
And what they're allowing is triplexes and fourplexes and even 6 unit buildings where single family houses stood. And that
I'm not sure I'm there for, let's say, the corner of McKinley and Nevada Avenue. I'm not sure I'm there. And I think there needs to be a lot more thought before we blow up these neighborhoods. What we've done is we've said we want to see more density on the arterials. Connecticut Avenue, I think, is a prime example. You have high-rise apartment buildings for most of Connecticut Avenue. And it works, we're okay with that. And then off to the side in the neighborhoods, you have that single family housing for which there's a huge demand. And if we want to increase housing substantially in the city, we're going to do it by developments such as Massachusetts Avenue downtown, think 5th Street, or in Noma, or at the Wharf, or north of the Navy Yard, where we've seen substantial high-rise residential development. And therefore, we've seen tens of thousands of units. But to say that we're going to solve our housing problem by blowing up the single-family detached housing on McKinley Street, for example, I'm not sure that's where we should be going right now. But there is that tension in the council. Councilmember Robert White has been trying to push for some changes in that regard. And as I said, Councilmember Nadeau a couple of years ago. And I just thought I would bring that up here. I don't think that that's the solution to our housing demand.
Well, I appreciate that, because one of the questions I was going to ask a little deeper in, but I see our time is starting to get short. So let me read this, if I may. Residents have been concerned that while the comp plan confines itself in Rock Creek West to zoning increases along the major corridors, there's a second agenda that has evolved in several recent DC government documents. It involves upzoning residential streets to accommodate what is often called gentle density or missing middle housing. For example, the Office of Planning's report, Single Family Zoning in the District of Columbia, April 2020, recommends promoting gentle density in single family zones that are high cost, high opportunity, or near transit. Are you familiar with these ideas? I guess you are. You just said you were. Is this consistent with the comp plan amendment for Rock Creek West?
Well, the comprehensive plan, the amendments that we've made do support the Office of Zoning and Zoning Commission looking at gentle density. We don't say more than that. So I'll give you an example. If you go up 16th Street, get up around Nicholson, I think it's Nicholson. If you go west on Nicholson, it's only a couple blocks and you run into the park. You'll see duplexes. And they really look like single family housing. I don't know that if you were to have that kind of, I'm going to be a little dramatic here. If you were to tear down the houses at McKinley in Nevada and replace them with these duplexes, I don't know that that would really be a shock to the neighborhood. There is an economic cost to that, so I don't know that that's actually likely to happen. But I want to emphasize that the idea here is gentle. So another approach is to encourage English basements. So folks who turn their basement, I live in a row house, so an English basement is rather obvious. So if I was in a single family house detached, I'm not sure an English basement would be as obvious. But that might be another approach. I think we have to look at this carefully because where we can accommodate some additional density without transforming the character of the neighborhood, and I want to be clear that when I say character, you know, Chevy Chase has a character about it with the architectural style, the size of the houses, the setbacks, the lots, that's different than, well, I'll say Capitol Hill, which is row houses. So I think the general density that fits within the character, we shouldn't just simply dismiss out of hand. We should look at it, consider it, and see if it would work, how it would work, how we would go about that. But in my view, that's not the solution to our housing crisis. That just provides a little bit more flexibility. And that the solution to our housing crisis is going to be the production of thousands, tens of thousands of units.
Brookings Institute did a study on gentle density, building triplexes, fourplexes, and 6-unit buildings, specifically in Chevy Chase. What they found was that if you buy a property, $1 million property, which is not uncommon, essentially raise it and then build a triplex or a fourplex, each unit winds up being $1 million. So it doesn't solve the problem of affordability. It simply creates more housing, but not affordable housing.
My answer to that would be it's complicated. So although I generally resist the idea of trickle down, and I probably shouldn't have used that term, I do believe that part of our housing crisis in the city, our affordability crisis, is the fact that there's too little housing. And if we increase supply, I mentioned this before, so that when the yuppies want to buy their first house, they could look to Deanwood and price out through all of them moving into Deanwood with the demand to buy housing and outbidding what the list prices are. They could force up the values and displace the residents who are there. But if they have other places that they can buy housing, market rate housing, that actually will reduce the demand on areas right now that are affordable, that are moderately priced. So supply is important in housing. I lost my train of thought here. There was more to what you said with regard to the Brookings.
Well, let me jump in on my very last question. I see that we have a lot of Q&A, but if I can ask this question. In a statement to constituents regarding the comp plan, Ward 3 Council Member Mary Chey said, quote, "Part of what makes Ward 3 so desirable is its feeling of open spaces and historic character. For these reasons, I am pleased that the Office of Planning's proposal keeps density increases confined along our main corridors. I am also pleased that the suggested density increases on our key commercial arteries will provide for growth consistent with the area's character." I think in the previous question, you pretty much agreed with that.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. We always have to leave some room for for some room for change or evolution, but I don't think it should be dramatic. I think that is that's missing other dynamics, which is that people like the areas where they live, and we need to respect that and support that.
So we have a lot of Q&A, but you've been with us for an hour, which is.
I'm good for a little bit longer. I got this.
Are you?
I for a moment looked in the chat and I saw something about triplexes don't blow up neighborhoods, and maybe not. I mean, it really depends. I will refer whoever wrote that. Go to Nicholson and 16th. I don't think that would be offensive. In let's say in many neighborhoods in Ward 3, but I don't know that that's necessarily what some of my colleagues are talking about. And I also think that when we're looking at how we accommodate growth, that it needs to be more flexible and more sensitive to the particular neighborhoods. What you do in Chevy Chase is going to be different than what you do in Cathedral Heights, which is going to be different than what you do on Capitol Hill.
I'm seeing another piece in the chat. I was going to go just to the Q&A, but this is interesting. Michelle Wallen says, I have good friends who live in Minneapolis, and I can tell you that they are very unhappy that their city council did this. Some people are even leaving the city because of this. Plus, even a duplex or triplex built here will still be very expensive.
That was the other part of your question.
What's that?
But let me say this: there was a report a few years ago that I looked at that said that, and I touched on this earlier, Minneapolis, something like 70 to 80% of its residential land was zoned for single-family detached housing. There was a city in California, I want to say, I don't think it was San Diego, San Paulo. It was like 90% of its residential land was zoned for single-family detached. In Washington, D.C., it's less than 40%. And almost all of our zone districts permit residential. So it's too simple to simply say, well, they did it in Minneapolis, we should do it here. The other thing I was going to say, though, and this was part of your question earlier, the economics are not simple either. And by that, I mean, I remember a few years ago when I was looking to buy a house, I looked at some row houses on 16th, just off of 16th Street, just north of the park, and like Barnum Street. And there was a row house that had been bought by a developer, been a single family row house, and they were converting it into an 8-bedroom, or not an 8-bedroom, 8-unit condominium. And I can guarantee you those 8-unit condominiums are going to be in aggregate far more in value than that house, that single family house. So it does speak to the fact that you create more density does not in itself mean that everything's going to be affordable. The economics are more complicated. And I would venture that if we were to change all the housing in Chevy Chase to duplexes, they probably would be very expensive.
I see a question from ANC Commissioner Lisa Gore. Allow me to read that. What level of affordability is in the comp plan? You correctly cited the average income level of the AA community, but that income is near the 50 to 30% level, not 80%. I guess AA is African American community, but that income is near the 50 to 30% level, not 80%, which is my understanding what the comp plan will call for, affordability level. How does this not perpetuate the continued exclusion of the African American community in strategies like IZ?
We have to have a standard. The standard that we use is the same as the HUD standard, which is area median income. And I believe the HUD standard says that area median income, 80% of area median income is affordable. Now, what we do in the comprehensive plan is we say that, and this is one of the amendments we approved yesterday, that the median income for African-American households in the city is about 40,000. I'm going to say about 40% AMI. And so if we want to provide more housing to low-income folks and African-American households, then we're going to have to provide what we call very low and extremely low income affordability. So there's nothing wrong with the standard. The standard is AMI, area median income. It's then what percentage against that AMI that you focus your subsidization. And what we call for, particularly with regard to public land and public dispositions and publicly supported housing development, is we call for very low, which I believe is 60% below, and extremely low, which is 30% and below AMI. So again,
30% of,
which is being criticized, it's the percentage against the standard, and we are targeting exactly what the commissioner was citing, which is the roughly $40,000 households.
You may get a message from her asking for some more clarification. Let me move along. Cheryl Wasserman asks, I was pleased to read that you were going to annotate the comp plan in our area to indicate that no zoning changes should be made until the small area plan is complete and can be in effect to guide zoning. Is that what actually happened or will happen?
When the Office of Planning sent the amendments to the council a year ago, they drew a circle around 9 areas. Most of those 9 areas, one of which was Chevy Chase, saw some increase in density, what we call upflowing. The circle or lasso was to say there would be more planning before there was significant development. They used the phrase significant, which I've learned over the years can be a huge loophole. I mean, every developer will say their project's not significant if that's a way to get around the restriction. So we tightened that restriction and said, no, if there's planning before rezoning, then there's planning before rezoning. But we did create some very specific exceptions. If there's a small area plan, we didn't enumerate all of them. We said exception where there's planning such as a small area plan. But we included in that list of planned unit development. I think I actually spoke to this earlier. So if a developer comes in with a planned unit development, they would not be constrained if it included a rezoning. But with a planned unit development, there's going to be some planning analysis. And frankly, with regard to Chevy Chase, because the small area plan is underway, I don't see that the zoning commission would set down a PUD until that small area plan is done.
Okay. I think that's as definitive as we can hope to get. Ellen McCarthy asks, one of the reasons that the comp plan takes a long-range perspective is to provide guidance for the city's capital budget. What tools are available to the city to deal with school overcrowding in Ward 3 if we succeed in meeting the comp plan's goal of increasing the number of housing units? And furthermore, we're hoping that the small area plan addresses that, but I'm not sure that it will.
I'm not sure it will either, but that would be great if it did. So let me, I will venture just my own opinion as a legislator, and that is that, yeah, it's nice to think that the comprehensive plan will influence the capital budget, but I've never seen that happen, so I'm not optimistic it will happen. However, probably most people have not read the bill itself. They've only read the chapters that are being adopted through the bill. But the bill itself includes, I believe it's section 3, which calls for a new master facilities plan for public schools. We've had in the law since the early 2000s a requirement that the city has to have a master facilities plan for schools. We have amended and rewritten that over the years to try to get a plan that was useful. A couple of years ago, the mayor submitted to the council a master facilities plan in compliance with the law. There was a hearing on it. It was roundly criticized, and we disapproved it. The mayor took the position that the law only required that she submit a master facilities plan, therefore she complied with the law. It's been my view that the goal was not to have a document submitted. The goal was to have a master facilities plan. And as I said, we disapproved it. So we have in this legislation a requirement for a new master facilities plan. I believe it has to come out by 2027. There's some back and forth between me and the executive because they don't like what I'm doing. And so we're trying to work that out. But in my view, and this is why I disapproved why I moved to disapprove the master facilities plan that they sent down. The master facilities plan needs to address how we're going to resolve the over-enrollment crisis in Ward 3. I think it's ridiculous that the catchment area for Wilson is so huge. It may not literally be half the city, but it feels like it's half the city. Deal is, I mean, I just think it's not good. The Deal has got this huge school population, and I think is continuing to grow. And we've got to figure out how we're going to deal with this enrollment crisis. And we're seeing our elementary schools, every one of which is bursting at the seams. There was a controversy in the fall over Lafayette with its pre-K, because if I remember correctly, it doesn't have room for its pre-K. And of course, we want pre-K. But the master facilities plan didn't address any of that. To give you an example, the city acquired the old military road school. I think that's a good thing. But then they're like ad hoc, deciding what to do with it. Well, that's not a good thing. How does it fit into a plan? What is the plan? And on the south side of the ward, the city is going to build a new middle school on Foxhall Road, and they acquired the old Georgetown Day School off of MacArthur Boulevard. I think those were also good moves. Not the best in that if I were to be able to just take a blank slate and plop a new building onto the map, I would put it more centrally in Ward 3 rather than at the southern end. But those were good moves, but it's all ad hoc. How does it fit into what is the long-term scheme for dealing with the over-enrollment? That's appropriate to the master facilities plan, not to the comprehensive plan. But the comprehensive plan legislation hasn't gotten much attention, does have a requirement that the city, having failed to produce a master facilities plan 2 years ago, has to do it by 2027.
Do you think that the small area plan should attack the issues of traffic, parking, open space for within a relatively small boundary around, say, Connecticut Avenue, for additional things that will be created as a result of this upzoning?
I think that the small area plan should reflect what the community working with planners wants. If I was in the room, I would argue it should include those things. But my answer is that the community has got to want to include that.
Well, I think it does. I'm on that small area plan citizens advisory committee, and it's been very difficult so far to focus. It's at the early days of that work, but it's been very hard to focus on those kinds of specific things. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful that we will start to do that.
Sometimes these are not easy issues.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easier to avoid them. But the challenge is that they've got to be addressed, and they're either going to be addressed directly and explicitly in a planning process, or they will be addressed reactively as events unfold over the next 5-10 years.
Let me see if there are any other specific.
There was something in the chat. It was, I think, the first item. The Planning and Zoning Commission are part of the same DC agency. That's actually not correct. The Zoning Commission is independent, and it's supported by the Office of Zoning, which is independent. That is to say that it's not subordinate to the mayor. The mayor doesn't appoint. The mayor cannot fire. The Office of Planning, however, is subordinate. That's actually from the Home Rule Act, which says that the mayor shall be the chief planning officer for the city. So the Zoning Commission is in a position that it could rule against OP initiatives. And sometimes the Zoning Commission does disagree with the Office of Planning. Zoning Commission gives a lot of deference to the Office of Planning because professional planning expertise is in the Office of Planning. And the Office of Planning is there with the Zoning Commission at every hearing because they're a participant. But the Zoning Commission has the ability to be independent and to disagree. And in fact, that's to some extent the result of the quality of the commissioners. The zoning commissioners recognize and value their independence, they'll act accordingly. And if they see themselves as being subservient to the mayor does appoint them, then they will be less independent. So in the end, it comes back to the mayor, the quality of her appointments.
Here's a question that I think goes to a good point. It's from Jonathan Chait. I just want to register my view. I have owned a house 2 blocks from Connecticut Avenue since 2003. I support the plan and want to build as much housing in the city, and want to build as much housing in the city as possible. I'm not sure he wants to see housing built, not only for environmental, racial justice reasons, but so that my children can hopefully afford to live here too. I think that's just a comment. I'm not sure there's a question there.
Okay.
Ann Coman writes, what about the displacement of small businesses like cleaners, which are important for the community? I suppose she's saying that if the west side of Connecticut Avenue is built up, there'll be buildings that are raised, and services will be displaced.
Not necessarily, but possibly. So what comes to mind is the redevelopment on Wisconsin Avenue over by Newark Street, where the Giant Food is. There used to be a Giant Food. Next to the Giant Food was a G.C. Murphy's. Next to that was Moon Palace Chinese restaurant, a gourmet place if I ever saw one. And then next to that was Cactus Cantina. So that block got redeveloped, and Moon Palace disappeared. Cactus Cantina is still there and thriving. Giant, of course, is still there because they did the redevelopment. Behind it was a paint store, as I recall, and also an interesting, I want to say Lebanese, I think I've got it wrong, delicatessen, which relocated over to Foxhall Square on New Mexico Avenue. So you can lose some of these businesses. For the most part, they tend to be kept. That's really, if you get a matter of right development, which is probably less likely, there's less control over what the retail is going to look like. If you get a planned unit development, there's probably more control over what the commercial will look like. I think that for Connecticut Avenue, you absolutely need neighborhoods serving retail, like the cleaners. And that's not likely to be displaced. But as I said before, it's not likely, but it's possible. So the development needs to be, and in terms of the small area plan, needs to speak to this. The fact that the neighborhood serving retail is important.
We have another question, Nancy Wilson. Is it true if a developer gets approval to build a building and agrees to have a percentage of the units affordable, that the affordable units do not have to be in that new building?
I believe that's possible, but that's usually not the case. And I think that both the Zoning Commission and the Office of Planning look down on that. The value of the inclusionary zoning is that it's on the site. The goal is not to build more low-income housing in low-income neighborhoods. The goal is to have a greater economic mix. If we really want to help folks who have all the means to take care of themselves except for the money, and then research has shown that a greater degree of integration actually can make a difference. So that's the theory behind the inclusionary zoning, is that you want to have more economically integrated communities. I can put this a little bit differently, and that is what we saw from the post-World War II attempts at housing and urban renewal was a concentration. We thought that by building public housing that we were doing a good thing by providing affordable housing for low-income families, never have to pay more than 30% of their income, wherever it is, for their housing. But we also then concentrated poverty, which had ill effects. And what we've also seen is that more affluent communities have the ability to absorb some percentage of low-income people without any deleterious effect. And it not only does the affluent community have that ability, but then it's a very good outcome for those low-income families. So that's what the goal is here, is to create that greater degree of integration.
Well, that's why I opened this question period saying that people in Chevy Chase do welcome people with all levels of economic ability for housing here, and workforce housing in particular. Because I do believe, and I think that most of the people I know here believe, that it would enrich our living experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take two more of the Q&A, and then you've been very generous with your time. It's a little hard to maintain a conversation and look through the Q&A. Some of these are redundant.
I'd like to comment that I'm smart to smell a rat on the MPLS stunt.
What is the comment?
Phil is smart to smell a rat on the MPLS stunt.
Ron Kahn says, we have underdeveloped RA4 areas near Connecticut, 90-foot apartments. These CLUM areas would seem to be simple, efficient, less impactful, and effective guide to specifically address affordable housing goals versus the complexities of MU4/IZ. With those existing RA4 areas not considered, also know that the DC official zoning map is error prone. When I said we might get into the weeds, I think this is the weeds. But if you have an answer, I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, it is a little bit more detailed than I can deal with. The MU4 is a mixed use zone. It's a fairly low density zone, and it allows greater flexibility. It doesn't have to be mixed use. If it is, the commercial is low density, but it allows greater flexibility to a developer. What I've come to realize over the years is that flexibility is a good thing. It allows for design variations. It can allow for additional density. The additional density can then include a lower income or affordable housing units or some other amenity. We call them amenities. So I'm just trying to think of some other examples. Sometimes architecture is considered an amenity. Some public facility could be an amenity, but we've made it clear with these comprehensive plan amendments that affordable housing is an amenity. So discretionary zoning has its benefits, and a straight residential, where I think what I heard was that there is a matter of right. That's not necessarily as likely to happen. I mean, I'll put it this way. You know, if you think about it, the built environment of our city, in a sense, is a public amenity. When you drive up and down Connecticut Avenue, in a sense, all those buildings belong to us. We experience them every day. They're part of our city. They're the fabric of our community. But the government doesn't build them. The private sector builds them. It's almost like a public-private partnership. And so if you think of it that way, what's the best way to stimulate the private sector in this public-private partnership in terms of getting what we want? And so if we don't stimulate, then we just sit back, the government just sit back and wait and see if private sector wants to do anything. If we do stimulate them, then maybe we entice the private sector to come and do something. It's an interesting relationship, and I think most people don't think of it this way, but really development is a P3, a public-private partnership.
Last question for tonight. I know there will be some questions that go unanswered, but this comes from ANC Commissioner Peter Goslin, who represents the west side of Connecticut Avenue, among other parts. He says, with the new federal money, could the city depend less on private developers and more on public money? I suppose he means in terms of acquisition of properties for construction.
Well, I can tell you that I've already seen from various advocacy groups, particularly progressive advocacy groups, and a couple of council members, more progressive council members, that they've been laying claim to hundreds of millions of dollars for this and that and something else. And we're very quickly sucking up all the $2.3 billion in federal money. I mean, $300 million for this, $300 million for that. We have a housing production trust fund, which is our primary vehicle for providing affordable housing. The housing production trust fund, Mayor Bowser built that up to $100 million. And early in her term, and she's tried to stay there. I think the last couple of years she got a little bit above that. I think she'll be going higher than that this year. So let's just pick a number like 300 million. She puts 300 million, that's 3 times what we've done before. That's going to be a substantial prod for building affordable housing. And what we do with that is we leverage that against the private sector. A lot of it goes to nonprofit developers who build affordable housing. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of the money going there. I think a lot of the federal money needs to be going into education, because I think education is the long-term strategy for dealing with a lot of our social justice issues. So we talk about job training, for example, more jobs for DC residents and helping those who are unemployed, overwhelmingly or disproportionately, I should say, disproportionately African-American. But it's really harder to do job training for an adult than it is to educate a kid properly so that when they get out of high school, they're ready for a job. And that's just one way of illustrating that. I think education is the key to resolving a lot of our social justice issues. And so I think a lot of the federal money needs to go there. I think I strayed a little bit from the question.
No, I think you answered the question plus more.
Good. I do see a couple in the chat at the end. Why don't OP count rent control as affordable housing? I don't know what they do, but I would say that because rent control is not means tested, I don't think, well, I think it's an important tool for affordable housing. I don't think it's fair to count rent control units as affordable housing. If I move into a building that has rent control with my salary as chairman of the council, I mean, that's not an affordable unit. It might be affordable to me, but that's not a good use of affordable housing. And rent control is not means tested. The other question here is, when will the second reading be on the comprehensive plan? I expect it will be in 2 weeks. That is May 18th.
Sir, you've been very generous with your time. And I hope we haven't imposed on that generosity. And I hope that you'll come back in 6 or 8 months so we can discuss other issues.
Well, what I'd love to do is meet with you all in person at the Chevy Chase Community Center. It seems to me that's the proper way to do this.
I think I've been looking forward to in-person meetings for a year now, like most of us. So once everybody is inoculated and we feel safe about that, then I'd love to invite you to do that. Okay. And maybe we'll make a joint ANC CCCA meeting and invite the public to come out and talk.
By the way, this is completely out of left field, but I'm going to have a hearing. I'm pretty annoyed with DCRA over vacant properties along with other things. I'm having a hearing. I'm going to file the notice tomorrow on vacant properties, and I'm going to include 2900 Military Road. Does that mean anything to anybody?
2900 Military.
Yeah, I'm going to beat up on the DCRA over that property.
I can't picture that property.
It's got boards and
They're pretty nice houses over there.
Yeah, it's got boards and a fence around it.
I'll drive past tomorrow.
Okay, take pictures when you do.
I'll take pictures. I'll send them to you. Well, thank you again. I'd like to make a plug for CCCA. If you've enjoyed this webinar, Please go to our website. If you'd like to be part of the organization, please join. And we hope to bring other interesting webinars and dialogues in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.